I'm going to start with a little bit of context. I live in an apartment building, in a neighborhood with mostly single-family houses. This has the advantage of giving me a great view, as opposed to the crowded cityscape that I was used to. The building is pretty modern, less than 5 years, and luckily, with the modern design, came floor-to-ceiling windows that I really enjoy. It's one of the bigger buildings with around 15 floors, and my place is on the 10th floor. The window in my living room has 4 equally sized sections, with one being a door to go out to the balcony. I have the habit of checking the view every morning while I eat breakfast, which is how I noticed the change. I don't want anyone to know where I live or who I am, so I'm not going to share any pictures, but you should have all the relevant information. I first noticed it on the 1st of January last year. It might have started a few days before, but I doubt it. I have been kind of stressed in my life lately, and checking the view helps me get started in the morning. I think I noticed when I was walking between the 2 leftmost sections of my windows. One of the rooftops had a different color on the leftmost window. The original house was kind of a red brick, and the other house was dark gray. Those are the colors of most of the rooftops around here, so none of the houses look weird by themselves. It wasn't obvious and pretty far, but I know the view well enough that I noticed it right away. I was hungover on that day, so even though it was weird, I felt that being alive after the night that I had was weirder. I spent the day mostly doing my best to be alive, and I didn't pay attention to it much. I assumed that my brain and eyes were just dying as much as I was, and the next day I looked again, and it was still the same. I checked every single window in my apartment, and I could only see the gray roof in one of them. I checked from the balcony. Nothing was out of the ordinary. The other house wasn't anything noticeable at first, and it was the same style as most of the houses around it. A 2-story house with a front yard and a backyard. The kind of house I wish I could afford. Everything around it was the same. The gardens were the same state, with the trees and the same plants. So I ordered some binoculars online, and the next day I checked the other house in detail. Apart from the roof, there were a lot of differences that I could now see. Nothing was out of the ordinary for the city where I live. They had a similar style of architecture, but they were obviously different houses. The number and shape of the windows were different. The front porch had a different design, etc. And if they had been next to each other, there wouldn't be any problem. But they were in the same place. I had no explanation for what was happening. I searched online, and nothing helpful. I had a moment of hope when I read that a defect in the glass of the window might distort the light. I tested to see if there was anything abnormal by putting random objects on the other side, but everything appeared as expected. In hindsight, that was a long shot, but I was getting desperate. One day, I felt particularly brave and went out directly to check the house. I walked there. It took about 15 minutes, and unsurprisingly, I saw the original house. I tried to knock, but I got no answer. I checked from the windows as much as I could without risking getting noticed. And from what I could see, the house looked pretty much abandoned. From a few viewpoints that I managed to get to, most of the furniture inside was covered with sheets, and nothing showed any sign of recent use. Before I left, I tried to open the door, but there was no luck. A few days later, I had another idea to try. I set up my phone on a makeshift tripod to film the other house from my window, and I went there again. When I got there, I kept my actions simple so I wouldn't forget what I did and would notice if my actions were different on the video. I went up the steps to the porch and knocked. Waited a bit, no answer again. And then I walked the length of the porch before leaving. As soon as I came back, I watched the video. It showed me doing the exact same thing as I remember doing, until I started walking the length of the porch. You see, the porches are not the same in each house. In the original house, after you get up the steps, you have some distance on each side. In the other house, the porch was smaller and only on the right after you get up the steps. In the video, I saw myself walk around on the right and then go back towards the left side. When I reached the left wall, I just stood there, looking at the wall. I didn't touch the wall, and if there was an acceptable distance to stand in front of the wall, that's how far I was. I wasn't sure what to expect. I might have been less freaked out if I saw myself go through the wall or walk into it like a video game NPC. After that, I started avoiding the window, where I could see it. It made me uncomfortable. As long as I didn't look at it, I could pretend that everything was normal. But it was always in the back of my mind. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, I still couldn't resist checking every morning, with a small hope that everything would be back to normal. In February, I left for around a week to go visit family. I checked when I came back, and it was still the same. At that point, I started being more annoyed by it than unsettled. It became part of my routine, a quirk of an apartment that you have to get used to. Annoying, but insignificant if you adapt, like a stovetop with a single broken burner. Then April arrived, and with it, the brand new third floor of that damned house. It didn't appear new. It was still nothing out of the ordinary, except from the fact that it appeared overnight. In a house I could only see from one window. At that point, my first reaction was as expected. I panicked. As weird as the situation was before, at least it was stable. The change hit me way harder than when I saw the house for the first time. I used every piece of paper and cardboard to cover every inch of the window. Only then I managed to calm down. Out of sight, out of mind. It worked for a few days, until I noticed that the view that I enjoyed so much was not so calming anymore. Even if I couldn't see it, I knew the other house was still there. There was dread in the back of my head every time I looked outside, somehow knowing it was there. Without seeing it made it feel even worse. So I removed the coverings and looked at the house for the first time in a few days. Now 4 stories high. The house was towering above the houses around it. The new floor didn't seem to have been added to the top like the last one, but instead between the first and second one. It was made out of a different material than the rest of the house. Instead of painted bricks like the other floors, it was smooth. The material in itself didn't look anything out of the ordinary, but the use of 2 different materials on the house was unusual. That, and the fact that it was around 2 times taller than the average house, somehow, because something was now clearly wrong, it made me feel better. I think it's because so far I thought that something was wrong with me, and now it was clear to me that the house was what was wrong. I did 2 things after that. First, I went out and bought a camera. I bought the best one I could afford and made sure it could film in low light. My idea was to record the next time a floor would be added to see how it happened. I followed a guide to set up automatic backups to make sure I wouldn't lose anything before I could watch it. Second, I finally decided to call for help. I'd been avoiding inviting anyone because I didn't want my friends to think I was crazy. But now being crazy seemed like it might be the better option. I showed one of my friends for the first time and they noticed right away. And then they showed a complete lack of interest in it. Sort of like a, oh no, anyway, meme or something. They didn't seem to want to talk about it at all. And I tried to show them again, but they answered as if it was the most boring thing imaginable. And I asked a second friend a few days later, and they had the same reaction. I asked them to describe it to me, just in case they were seeing something else, and it took a bit of convincing, but they did, so they described the exact same thing that I was seeing. And they just didn't care about it at all. I called back my first friend to check what they had seen, and they didn't remember seeing it at all. They remembered everything else we did on that day, but not me showing them the other house. Since asking for help didn't seem to do anything, I fell back to my first plan. I kept an eye on the camera. I fast-forwarded through the recording every day, checking for anything unusual. And this was my routine for the rest of the year. On the first day of this year, I woke up to a room that was strangely a bit darker than usual. I went half asleep to go check the camera, as I usually do. It had fallen down during the night and was filming the ceiling. I checked later, and of course nothing useful was in the recordings. I looked to see if anything had changed, which made clearer why the apartment felt darker. The house was now at a monstrous height, far taller than my floor. It had a tree-looking shape, a tree made from an unholy collection of floors with different styles, materials, and colors. The first floors were still as thin as the original house, but they grew thicker, almost distorted. On the higher floors, it also had floors branching out, each branch having apparently grown at its own speed, like a regular tree. The impossible architecture cast its shadow, blocking the morning sun from reaching that single window of my apartment. It was so absurd to see that I could do nothing else but had to accept it. I gave up on things ever going back to normal. This was my life now. I had tried everything I could think of, and I just had to live with it, no matter how wrong it felt. For those wondering, I have been considering moving since the start. I even found a few places in my price range, but I decided against it each time. My life isn't the most exciting. Nothing really interesting has ever happened to me, no matter how scared I am. And I am. When I have some quiet time to think about it, I can't bring myself to just leave it behind me, you know? I don't know what I'm going to do from now on, but I need to see this thing to the end. I wasn't planning to share this with anyone, and I have no advice for people in the same situation. I don't have a lot of hope that people can help me, and the latest developments made me realize that I may not be able to share my story once it's over. So I decided to share what I could before something happens. For the last week or so, I noticed a branch that is growing differently from the others. Usually they branch out for a bit. I kept an eye on the new one for a few days to make sure, and now I don't have a doubt about it anymore. It's growing. Straight towards me.